Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 118th branch meeting of the IIRSM UAE branch committee. Today we have Ian Holder with us, Managing Director of Bain Simmons, and providing us with a presentation on driving safety culture improvement. I have heard the previous presentations were received very well, so I think that's what we're going to experience today as well. First, we will go through a few of the monthly messages. So we will start with the introduction and branch updates. Ian will probably around 6:15 take over from me and guide us through the safety culture improvements, and then we goes off towards 6:45, 7 o'clock. Just an update on our LinkedIn page. As we have seen positively month over month, we see an increase in followers. I still see a lot of engagement on the website as well. We keep posting updates of IIRSM on our LinkedIn page. And we have a very active WhatsApp group where I see a lot of questions and answers and follow-up passing by. So I think that's very good. That's good that we have that engagement within the group. A special thank you to Sandeep, who shared earlier this morning a update of the Abu Dhabi Public Health Center, who launched their digital certificate. So previously, the occupational safety and health management system certificates were issued these days, and from the 2nd of October, that was already. It's a electronic application, and all to do with the initiative of the authorities to promote paperless workplaces. So Sandeep, thank you for sharing the information. I think that will be beneficial for everyone having a registered occupational safety and health management system in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. Training courses. No more training courses for the year 2023, but we start next year in January with Managing Risk, the Essentials, followed in February with Managing Health and Safety Risks, the Essentials, and that will be repeated in May and June as per the training schedule for now. Keep an eye on the website as more trainings may be added to the list, to the calendar. And if you have any specific information, feel free to get in contact with the training department. Branch meetings. A couple of branch meetings for this month and early next month. So we see Oman with a branch meeting on October the 12th. Third-party risk management as topic. Saudi will follow October 17th, Qatar on the 24th, and our India colleagues have their branch meeting on October 25th, followed by November 7th, Oman branch meeting again, and the UAE branch meeting for the month of November will be on the 8th. UK and Europe branches. I just picked out two. There are many more branch meetings. You can register for them as well. But the London branch meeting is on October 18th, with the topic being a safety professional, a conversation about managing the conflicting priorities of stakeholders. I think that would be a very interesting topic. I think we recognize that as professionals. And then there is a Europe branch meeting on October 26 on COP28, the mega trends for risk managers. And I think specifically in the UAE, that might be of interest as we will be hosting the COP28 towards the end of this year. Memberships, membership benefits. I continue to repeat that. training and qualifications, policy and technical advice, network mentoring scheme, and a continued discount of 20% using the UAE 25 code for new members. Let's see. Future branch meetings, as I mentioned, November 8th, and then we end the year on December 13th with the last branch meeting of this year, and then we continue in 2024 on the 10th of January. And again, if there's anyone amongst the participants today who would like to present or share some best practices, feel free to reach out to me or any of the other branch committee members, and we can easily allocate some time during one of the following branch meetings. Then I would like to give the introduce Ian. Ian, as I mentioned, is managing director at Bain Simmons. Bain Simmons as an organization has a partnership with IIRSM since 2022, early 2022, I believe. And Bain Simmons is well known for at least anyone working in the aviation industry or those who have worked in the aviation industry. They will definitely be familiar with Bain Simmons, specialized in aviation regulations, compliance and safety management. Bain Simmons typically work with partners in civil and defense organizations. So yeah, a lot of experience and knowledge within the aviation sector. Ian himself joined Bain Simmons in 2015 as a principal consultant with a background in civil airline, as a civil airline pilot and commercial aviation senior manager, leading the flight operations and safety management expertise within the organization. And that was before he stepped up in a new role as managing director of Bain Simmons in 2018. With any further ado, Ian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll just start sharing my screen. So I need to, Branko, you to stop sharing, then I can start sharing.
Yeah.
Well, we're just doing that. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk, and thank you for all of you joining it. I will just get my screen shared. Hopefully that is now visible to you all.
Perfectly.
So yes, as Branko said, I come from Bain Simmons, and we are well known in the aviation industry. We're also increasingly getting pulled into other industries. So we work in nearly all transport industries these days, but quite a lot in maritime. And recently, actually, are talking into the banking sector around culture and driving cultural improvement. So we've got quite a wide experience, and we've learned a lot over the 20 years or so of our existence around safety culture. Now, 2 weeks ago, I was at the sort of annual gathering of safety professionals from the aviation industry, which was in Hanoi, the IATA World Safety and Operations Conference. And we had an executive director from the FAA stand up, and they said that they believed that culture was the single biggest risk improvement that an organization could make. And I agree with that. And indeed, in aviation, it is regulated for. We actually measure safety culture in aviation, and there are standards that organizations have to reach and have to be able to prove that they have a just culture, which if that doesn't mean anything to you yet, hopefully by the end of this 30 minutes or so, it will do. I am, as we're going through, watching the chat and the Q&A. So please, if you've got any questions at any point, please use that to write your questions in there. I'll keep my eye on them. And I know that Branko and Julia in the background are also doing that. So I'm happy to answer the questions as we go along. or we can have some Q&A at the end. But let's dive in then. So what are we really talking about with a short session as this? What's the point we really want to make? Organizations can make the greatest risk management gains from moving from a blame culture to a learning culture. Let me give you an example. So this picture we see here. So this is an event that happened in the UK some years ago. A junior doctor was administering some injections to a child that was obviously very poorly. And they had 2 injections to give. One of them was to be given into a vein, an intravenous injection into the arm, like we so commonly have. But the other one was to go into the spine directly. Now, if those were given the wrong way round, the spinal injection was given straight into the bloodstream, then it was fatal. This doctor was handed 2 almost identical needles to administer them, and administered them the wrong way round, and a child died. Now, of course, if we put ourselves into the shoes of the family of that child, it is very natural to want to blame, to want to have some feeling of closure and of some punishment of the individual that's made an error. But that blame process, the legal process to deliver that blame, took nearly 7 years. Now, whilst that was going on, another child in another hospital died because exactly the same error was made somewhere else. Neither of those doctors woke up that morning intentionally going to do a poor job. The same thing happened twice. So blame just didn't stop the event happening. So what is a learning culture? Let's explore that a little bit more. And to do that, we really need to think first, what do we mean by this phrase, culture, in the first place? So there are lots of wordy definitions about culture that talks about such things as a pattern or a system of beliefs. Behavioral norms is a phrase I hear very often. I prefer a much simpler phrase, which is, it's the way things are done around here. It's the way people behave when nobody is looking. Let's perhaps have an example of that. So certainly here in the UK, we have a lot of speed cameras on the road. But the culture around the behaviors that are expected on the road is to slow down for the speed camera, but then to speed up again. And very few road users have any kind of cultural problem with doing that. So when someone's looking, when the speed camera's looking, people do slow down or they get fined. When they're not near the speed camera, it is very normal here in the UK to drive considerably above the speed limit. I think it's interesting when I go around the world, as I'm fortunate to do, to see how that culture of driving changes. So any of you who spent much time in the United States will know that actually culture there, speeding is not really tolerated. So you see a lot less of it. So you can see that difference. If we think about our organizations, though, what leaders pay attention to, what they measure and control, will drive those behaviors. It will drive what people actually do when nobody is looking. So, for example, if all we measure is the output, the commercial output, or the whatever the organization is involved in, if that's all we measure and we just say, be safe, then actually what gets done is that commercial output. And people will start cutting corners to achieve that because they'll believe that's what their leaders actually want. And Branko mentioned earlier on, you have a future session about the conflicting priorities of stakeholders. This for me is one of those areas where leaders can really make a difference because they do have conflicting priorities. You need that commercial output, but you need to do it within compliance if you have regulation and within your tolerability for risk or to manage safety risk to as low as reasonably practical. And if all we measure is the commercial output, we will take shortcuts on all those other things. And of course, we'll carry on doing that in the mistaken belief that if it hasn't gone wrong yet, it isn't going to go wrong. of course, we all know that that is a folly, and that isn't risk management. So we do need leaders to understand that they need to influence the culture by measuring everything they want, commercial output and the safety controls that they've got in the system to protect that commercial output. So it's a leadership question. There is a challenge with culture, and that's that you can't see the culture that you're in. It's like the cat looking into the goldfish bowl. The goldfish doesn't know it's in a goldfish bowl. The cat very obviously can see that goldfish is in the goldfish bowl. And so it is with culture. So we as an organization spend a lot of time going into other organizations to measure their safety culture, that how they're performing is measurable, and to reflect that back to them so that they can understand their own culture, because from within the organization, that is very difficult. I'm just looking at some of the messages. There appears to be a problem with the sound, or is it just one person? I think that is just one. I will leave Julie to manage that. Thank you. So what do we mean then by culture? What is this measurable safety culture? Firstly, we need to think about, where does culture sit in our management system? Regardless of what the organization is involved in, you will have a management system that may have to look at regulatory compliance. You may have a compliance monitoring function. You may indeed have a human factors error management, some kind of investigation function within the organization. And of course, wrapping around that is your safety risk management. What are the hazards that you need to manage, particularly in your organization? But the things that make those work are the things around the outside. We need active leadership to drive a proactive culture. We also need people to be competent, to have the capability they need, and we need to assure ourselves this is working. And if I dig further into the cultural part, we start breaking that down into some elements. Just culture being the very center of it, and really the focus of the next 20 minutes, we're going to focus on just culture. But because that changes people's behavior. It also encourages them to start speaking out and to report the hazards that they're seeing day to day. So let's focus in on just culture. So we've talked about just a culture being how it's done around here, what people believe in around here. What do we mean by this phrase, a just culture? In aviation, it has a very particular definition, usually taken from the work of Professor James Reason, and it talks about a few things. So it talks about this idea of an atmosphere of trust. That's that idea of people genuinely believe in it. It's not just written on a wall. But people are encouraged to give essential safety information. They speak out. They talk about the challenges they see day to day. They report if they've made an error. But they are also very clear about where the line is drawn between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. So our management, our leadership is really making it clear to people what they do and don't expect. So that is the behavior of the teams themselves, that peers won't tolerate behavior that is over the line. So normally we talk about recklessness or sabotage. People won't tolerate that. The aim of it is to encourage an open and honest reporting of errors. Yes, it is, but it's also to create that behavior in the first place of, if you have regulatory compliance or your own procedures, people follow them and they expect their peers to as well. It's really important to make the point that it's not a no blame culture. Often in organizations, when they say we want to move away from a blame culture, they think, okay, we're going to try a no blame culture. But that sounds great in practice, but if you don't hold people to account at some point, then actually behaviors can degrade very considerably. Let's perhaps look at it in more detail. So what do I often see when we go into organizations? They play whack-a-mole, which is a game that you can see there. If you've never seen it, the moles keep popping up and you have to use the hammer to hit them down. And it's ceaseless. The moles keep coming back. An event occurs, it's caused by an error, find out who made the error, and then punish the individual. That is a very common cycle that I see in organizations, but rarely does it actually manage the risk. Why not? Well, because to make errors is very human. I like these two photos just because of what's written on the lorries. So the orange truck there says "We fit" on the back. Well, clearly you don't. And on the other one, on the road to success, there are no shortcuts. Well, if you've proven that to be true by trying to take a shortcut. Now, trucks going under low bridges is really common here in the UK. We have a lot of low bridges, and trucks and buses getting stuck under them is very, very frequent. Now, we could just simply blame the drivers. That's a daft thing to do. Drive a big truck under a low bridge. But actually, what was the planning of that journey like? How was it planned? Was there any involvement to make sure that we were looking for low bridges? How well are those bridges signposted? Is there anything before the bridge to help you judge your height before you go under the bridge? Clearly, in those cases, there wasn't. So we can blame the drivers if we like, but that isn't going to stop somebody else making the same error, because that's what humans do. So why do we like blame? It is very satisfying. If I go back to terrible cases like that doctor where a child died, for the family, of course, they really feel that they need that emotional satisfaction. Somebody has been punished for what's happened to our child. And it feels like that's made the problem go away. But as we can see with the case of the low bridges in the UK, it hasn't. It happens so frequently. This is really interesting in organizations. I see this a lot from organizations that haven't adopted a just culture, where leaders and managers use blame to redirect attention away from themselves. It wasn't me, it was those bad people over there. Whereas actually, maybe it is the systems and the processes that they own that are actually where the solution lies. It can appease corporate guilt. This is a problematic one. So sometimes when something has gone wrong, then it can help to, if we can identify an individual that we can blame, then maybe in the court, we can focus all the blame on the individual and not on the corporation. That can be very tempting for organizations. The problem is, of course, it doesn't fix the underlying problems. And this is one, depending on what your media is like in the UAE, certainly here in the UK, it is terrible and always wants someone to blame and will deliberately cause public outrage and then want blame to calm that public outrage. Again, it's not fixing the problem. So what is the problem with blame? Well, it's not fair. It's not fair if somebody's made an error, and we'll explore in a moment what an error is. But actually, it can be quite unfair. We all make errors all the time. It's not fair to always punish them. It will stop people reporting things. So it will mean as an organization, there is no opportunity to learn. It does cause people to start covering their tracks if an error is made. That can be very serious and can have very high financial penalties. Of course, it brushes the real underlying reasons under the carpet. We blame somebody, move on. You do not fix the problem, which therefore does nothing to stop it happening again. And it creates this false sense of security, what I often call the illusion of risk management. We've done something, but it hasn't fixed the problem. It can also cause you some employment problems, particularly if you blame somebody unfairly. And it is very much an emotional response, blame. It's a very human response. We need to remove ourselves from that and think what's in the best interests of the organization. At the same time, of course, we can't have no blame, because if people behave recklessly, then that actually endangers people, whether that be endangers people, equipment, or causes financial or reputational harm. It is endangering the system. it may well be endangering their colleagues. If it goes unpunished, then actually the organization loses credibility. They got away with something. Let's return to our earlier example then, because there is actually a good story that came out of this. So, as we've said, tragically, the wrong injection was used, the child died, and we had this 7-year period while another child died while we were seeking blame. Fortunately, during that process, somebody realized that actually it was too easy to make that error because the needles looked almost identical. So the first fix to put in place was to make sure that any needles that were to be used for spines were a very different shape and size from those to be used for veins, making it very obvious to a doctor or anybody administering the medicine that that was not a needle to be used intravenously. That is now an effective solution. It also caused the healthcare system here in the UK to start to really think about moving from blame to a learning culture. And actually, our health minister was recently on an international stage talking about this very thing. So it has started a cultural shift. So whilst obviously it was an awful situation for that family and actually for that doctor who made an error, there has been some progress from it since. So we can move. I am just reading in the Q&A. So the question is how to ensure the work of leadership is of the opinion to pose that QHSE is the top priority. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. This is a real challenge where we say one thing, but do another. That is a very dangerous approach for leaders to take. So the question really is around saying one thing to one group and then possibly even silencing people by paying compensation or paying them off to not speak out. This is back to that blame as a delicious emotion that I talked about earlier on. That feels satisfying. It deflects the blame from the leader themselves. But of course, it doesn't fix the problem. How do we go about persuading leaders that they need to behave differently to actually fix the problem rather than paying to have the problem silenced? I think that comes to education and to understand that what they're doing is perpetuating the risk in the organization, which will eventually come back on them. Because eventually, if the same area keeps having a similar problem, that leader is exposed that actually they are not fixing the problem. So it's probably one to have a more, if you'd like to have a more in-depth discussion after this about how do you go about doing that, I'd be more than happy to. But you're right, that is a real challenge and one that we see commonly, but to different degrees. Let's have a little look at this video. So what you saw there was an Airbus A320 getting airborne and the engine cowlings coming off because they hadn't been done up. Now, there are at least 2 individuals that should have checked that they were done up. Firstly, the maintenance staff that undid them in the first place, which is a common occurrence while they're checking oils and fluids around engines. They should have done them back up. Also, the pilots, every single time the aircraft gets airborne, the pilots are required to do a walk around. And one of the things they are supposed to be checking is that all panels on the aircraft are done up. So we know at least 2 people have missed this and the aircraft got airborne. And as you saw there, the cowlings then came off. Well, obviously, we could just blame them. You must be more careful. The problem is that hasn't worked. So we were aware of at least 45 times off that particular aircraft type, the engine cowlings came off. Now, we could blame at least 90 individuals for not checking there. But that one in the middle, the British Airways one, as you can see, it's happened to both engines. As the cowlings came off, they caused quite a bit of damage. And actually, we came quite close to that aircraft crashing into London. which obviously would have been catastrophic. So the risk here is enormous. Blame is not providing the solution. So we need to do something else. In this particular case, the challenge really was that the cowlings on the engine, when they were not locked closed, they still looked closed. They still held together. The actual latches to lock them closed were tiny and very, very difficult to actually see. And if we take the particular BA example, how did it get missed? Well, the maintenance staff were actually being very diligent. They opened the cowlings up. They were doing work on the engines. They were then called away by their boss to go and work on another aircraft. But they actually did remember they had to go back to that aircraft and shut the engine cowlings. When they got there, they found they were already closed. What had actually happened is, while they'd been away and they'd been distracted, somebody had moved the aircraft around. The aircraft they went back to was a different aeroplane. But of course they didn't spot that. And nor would most humans, nor would most of their peers. So we needed to do something different. And in this particular case, those engine cowlings have now been completely redesigned so that if they are not locked closed, they are very obviously open. We've made the cowlings proof of humans rather than just blaming people because it wasn't working. So how are we going to move to this just culture? Well, first thing we need to understand is we keep using words errors, mistakes. What do they actually mean? The important thing about an error is it's unintentional. So if we use our driving analogy again, if somebody misses a road sign because they're distracted by something else, maybe it's they're seeing a cyclist or seeing a child the other side of the road and they miss that road sign, they haven't chosen to speed. They are now speeding in error. They didn't mean to. It's unintentional. They've missed something because of distraction. That's an error. What's interesting about errors is that point they are unintentional. It's very difficult to blame somebody for something they didn't mean to do. And we all suffer this every day in our lives. We all forget where we put things. We all, pull on handles when the door is actually a push door because it's not labeled. Errors are very, very common. I think the really important point about errors is you can't tell people to be more careful because you can't be more careful on an unintentional act. We need to change something. If we can't live with the risk of humans making that error, we need to change something in the system. We need to manage the manageable. So let's just very quickly look at mistakes then and why they're different. This is an interesting picture, actually. Here in the UK, everybody thinks that the speed limit is different if there's more than one lane. And it's not true. The difference is whether there's a barrier in between the lanes. Mistakes are things that we do deliberately. They are what we plan to do, but because of a lack of knowledge, there's something we don't understand. We've chosen the wrong course of action. So errors and mistakes are very similar, but that's a slight difference. An error is unintentional. A mistake is intentional, but it's because of a lack of knowledge of something. So then we need to move on to violations, because sometimes errors and mistakes, the individual does not intend to not follow any rules, procedures, regulations. But sometimes people do choose to. They intentionally and deliberately don't follow rules. Rarely, though, do they intend there to be a bad consequence. They usually, and I say usually, there are obviously exceptions, they usually happen because they are targeted on their commercial output. And so to try and achieve more, they start to cut corners and don't follow rules. That becomes an organizational and a cultural question for leaders then. They clearly are a significant risk in an organization. And they are largely shaped by what people within a community believe. They are shaped by culture. I often go into organizations where it's very common for people to take shortcuts because that's what they believe their boss wants them to do. We need, though, to talk briefly about recklessness and sabotage. So they do happen. sometimes people do deliberately take risky decisions without any concern for what that might come. They don't necessarily intend there to be a bad outcome, though. That would be sabotage, which is usually a criminal act. But sabotage can manifest in different ways. So there's a video on YouTube of a cabin crew member for Southwest Airlines in the States who clearly has had a bad day for whatever reason. When they land, I'm sure those of you who fly regularly always hear the command doors to manual. Well, they deliberately didn't put their door to manual. They deliberately left it so that when they opened the door, the slide deployed. They actually went and got themselves a drink from the galley and slid down the slide whilst drinking a drink. Now, when you see the video, it is actually quite humorous, but actually it was an act of sabotage. They were deliberately stopping that aircraft from being able to go and fly again. And when those slides go out, there's a huge bottle on the end of it. It's really dangerous. It could have killed somebody. So actually, it's an act of sabotage and very, very dangerous act. That's criminality. That needs to be dealt with as such. Fortunately, it's rare, but does happen. So we've gone through a few behavior types, and I appreciate we've gone through them very quickly. How are we going to actually make sure that people understand where the line is drawn? They understand how they contribute to the risk of the organization. Well, we need some way of making sure that the way in which we judge people for their actions is consistent. And I'll briefly show you our model. There are others, I should say, and this is given away freely as well. So I'm not trying to sell you anything here. You can go onto the Bain-Simmons website and download this. At its heart, you need to follow some kind of process when something goes wrong, or even better, when somebody reports something that could have gone wrong. So you get a report of something, or you become aware of something. You may have to take some immediate action to stop it happening again. That may include removing the person from their duties, but that isn't punitive. That's not a punishment. That's just because we don't know what risk that individual poses. You then have to do an investigation, and that investigation needs to be by somebody who's a trained investigator and understands that to err is human, to understand all the reasons why we err. There are a multitude of reasons. The humanism, we're amazing. Our ability to reason and be creative is fantastic. But I often hear people describe the human brain as a supercomputer, and it really isn't. It's actually quite limited in its processing power. We cannot comprehend all of our different sensory inputs at the same time. Our brain takes shortcuts. It makes assumptions based on its past experience. It can't process all that data nearly fast enough, which is why we make errors so often. We're really not that impressive when it comes to raw processing power. We are when it comes to creativity. So we need somebody who understands that and understands the science behind that to do the investigation. We then need some kind of review of that investigation. We don't want the investigator applying judgments, because if that happens, nobody will trust the investigator. The investigators need to be neutral. We then conduct a review, though, that does decide, are the recommendations of that investigation accurate? Is it a good investigation? And it reviews the results of them to decide what behaviours an individual has followed, and therefore what are the effective mitigations we need to put into place. It may, at that point, choose to then pass it over to HR or to look at some form of punishment. But how are we making that decision? How is that review team, whoever that is in your organization, how are they making that decision? They need some kind of behavioral flowchart. So here's ours, and it's in essence quite simple, but it does need competent individuals to be able to answer these questions. So, for example, the first question, was there a conscious, substantial, and unjustifiable disregard for risk? It needs to be all three of those. quite often see organizations saying, well, they know they weren't following the rules. That's not what that question is. It's did they disregard the risk? The next question then is around, did they intentionally break the rules? If so, why? Was it some kind of organizational matter, or was it just their own personal choice? Because how you're going to fix it is different. If the action was not as intended, was it an error? Was it a mistake? Again, that changes how you'd fix the problem. And the results of that behavioral flowchart, once we've decided what behavior it is, we can then look at what are the effective interventions. But before we do that, we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. Would their peers have done the same thing? In other words, is it systemic? Is it a cultural behavior? Would others have done the same thing? And a good investigator will be able to find out whether that's the case or not. And also, has it happened before, either to the organization or to the individual? Because that changes how you intervene. Now you can see there's a dotted line, a dotted red line, because there is a line, if you like, a line in the sand that if someone's crossed over, then it is more about their accountability than the organization's. And you can see at the bottom there, we have this sort of increasing scale of accountability. So, for example, if people are not following rules because they've got targets, commercial targets on them, and they're violating for organizational gain, they are accountable to some extent of that, but most of the fix in that is how are we measuring performance. On the opposite side of that, if they've committed sabotage, it's very simple. And if nobody else would have done the same thing, and it's just that individual, you deal with that individual. The other end of that is an error. If an individual has made an error, an unintentional act, then all you can do is console them. You can't attach any blame to an error. If you can't live with that error being made, it creates too much risk, then we need to make some organizational change, like the example of the Airbus aircraft having to change how the latches work so that it becomes much more proof of humans. So that's the end of me talking. I would just reiterate, really, it is my genuine belief that if an organization has a blame culture, then moving towards a learning culture and really understanding some of the concepts that I've just briefly introduced, and by using models such as our FAIR model, but there are other models out there, that is the single biggest improvement in risk an organization can make. It is challenging to actually make that shift. And the question earlier was a really good example of that. We need leaders to really understand this. They need to be educated. They need to be competent. They need to understand why humans, people that work for them, do the things that they do, and to understand themselves that blame, tempting as it is, doesn't fix the problem and actually just carries on the risk for which they as a leader are themselves accountable for. So that for me is a really important journey. When organizations make that leap and the leadership team really understand that and drive cultural improvements for the organization, the risk goes down considerably. And I'll leave you with one example of that from my own background. So my first job was in the UK Royal Air Force as a pilot. And I left the Air Force in 2009. When I was in the Air Force, we thought it was really normal to lose 1 or 2 aircraft a year in training and to lose their crews. That was normal to us. But we also thought it was normal to act recklessly. That was the culture that we existed in. I was talking to a pilot recently who's in the RAF, and the UK Royal Air Force has adopted FAIR, they have adopted just culture. They've lost 1 aeroplane in training in the last 10 years. They have made a massive impact to the risks that the organization fails. And actually, they've improved their operational capability. So they've improved their output because doing things right the first time, having people behave the right way in the first time and report when they can't, makes an organization more efficient. So that's why I say moving from a blame to a learning culture really does drive business. Okay, that is it from me. If anybody wants to ask any questions or pick up on any points, then either please use the chat or the Q&A, or just turn your microphone on and speak. Thank you.
Yes, if anybody would like to ask a question verbally, if you just raise your virtual hand and then I can unmute your microphone. Okay, this is Mushtaq here. Here we go.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Yep.
Yeah, hi. Hi, and thank you. It was really very nice to hear from your inside outs. Very nice. It was presentation. So can we have number 3, 4, and 5 slides, if it is possible? Can you share with us?
I believe the slides are being shared, so I will talk to the team at IIRSM and make that happen for you.
We'll really appreciate. It was really very nicely presented. So thanks again.
Mushtaq, if you want to reach out to me at any point and discuss your particular challenge, then feel free. I believe my contact details will be shared with you. So more than happy to carry on the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I would like to have, because these person-to-person contact will be very easy for me to have, discussion and how to resolve such issues.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah,
I
fully
can
agree.
So nice.
I can share a copy of the PDF of your slides, Ian, and your contact details with those that are here today, if you want to let me have those.
Will do.
Really very really appreciate. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ian, I know that you're the field you're operating in is mainly aviation, and you mentioned in the introduction that Bain Simmons is slowly moving into marine and banking sector. But if you look at a wider kind of area, would you say that aviation is at the forefront of just culture compared to other industries?
The aviation was fortunate. So, and I say fortunate because often aviation is held up as this sort of shining example. But the reality of aviation is, if we go back to the 1950s and 1960s, we were killing a lot of people as that rush for air travel first started. So aviation, but quite in the early days, had to change. But I would say it's been extremely successful at it, to the point where, really, if you think about how many flights are taken every day and the really very, very small number of accidents that we have, is pretty impressive, because putting a bit of metal in the air with a couple of hundred people on board is a hazardous thing to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think aviation has made great strides, but it's done it mostly through regulation up to this point. So, for example, just culture is a regulatory requirement for airlines. They have to prove to their regulator that they really do have a just culture. It's not just a concept. So I think that has helped enormously. The real challenge that aviation faces now, and that actually all industry faces, is technological advances and global events and political events that are happening in the world are moving at a pace, and regulations cannot keep up with that. And so organizations increasingly have to recognize their own risks. And the people who knows that better than anybody are the workforce, those at the front end of an organization. So encouraging them to be able to speak up about what they're facing, it really, for me, is the way in which we're going to manage the future risks. But yeah, aviation was forced to get ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, and personally, I also believe that it's not something you change overnight. It needs dedication. It needs full focus, and I think the challenge is always that one mistake brings you easily back a couple of steps. So it needs to be a conscious decision within an organization as well to move forward.
Very much so. It needs commitment demonstrated from the leadership team, not just talked about, actually in their actions and how they treat the people. And it needs to be day in, day out. There will inevitably, along the way, be some errors made. I mean, that's the the whole point of this conversation. Leaders will make errors as well, but if they can quite quickly say, we got that wrong, they can stop it. But you're absolutely right. To move from a blame culture to a learning culture in a organization of sort of 200 or more people, which I'm imagining most of yours are, you are talking about a program of a few years to really shift the culture. Yeah, it's not something done overnight.
Thank you.
And it needs a plan.
Oh, sorry.
Any other questions?
No, we don't have any more questions. For everyone asking, once I've got the copy of the slides from Ian, I will send them out with Ian's contact details probably tomorrow, or what day is it tomorrow? Yep. Tomorrow, hopefully.
Tomorrow is Thursday.
Yes, it is. I don't work on Fridays. I'm getting confused.
Okay, if we have no further questions, and Ian, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was adds a lot of value. Very clear in how to look at things. I think just to briefly step back to the example you gave on the aircraft. I can imagine that in first instance, it's easy to blame a technician or a pilot of not spotting it, but the moment you got 45 similar incidents, it becomes a bit different. And I think that's as well as we all need to be aware of what's happening in our industry. We can look in our own organization, but it's as important to look what's happening in our industry to find out if we don't have any similar kind of incidents and what we can learn from each other. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who attended this session. As I mentioned before, our next meeting will be on the 8th of November. If there's anyone who wants to share some best practices or want to provide us with a presentation, please reach out to me. If there are no further questions, then I thank you all for attending and wish you a pleasant evening. Thank you, Ian.
Pleasure.
Thank you both.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.